The Japanese thought their island fortresses were escape-proof, thousands of miles of ocean, no supplies, no hope, but they made one fatal mistake. They forgot about the guy who didn't play by their rules, and that mistake cost them everything. In World War II, the Japanese Empire controlled hundreds of Pacific islands. They built massive prison camps on these remote rocks. Places like Cabanatuan in the Philippines, Palawan, Wake Island. These weren't just any prisons. They were death traps surrounded by jungle and ocean. The guards believed escape was impossible. Where would you even go? But then Douglas MacArthur showed up with a plan nobody saw coming. He called it island hopping, and it turned the entire Pacific War upside down. In the next 29 minutes, I'm going to tell you exactly how this strategy worked, why it terrified the Japanese, and what happened to those prisoners when their guards realized they were about to be cut off from help. This is a story about audacity, survival, and one of the boldest military strategies ever used. Let's set the stage. It's early 1942. Japan just pulled off one of the most aggressive military expansions in history. Pearl Harbor, done. Philippines, captured. Singapore, fallen. Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, all under Japanese control within months. The Empire of the Rising Sun stretched across an area bigger than the continental United States. Thousands of islands, millions of square miles, and the Japanese military dug in deep. They built airstrips, naval bases, supply depots, and heavily fortified positions on key islands. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent strongholds designed to hold territory forever. Now here's the thing about islands in the Pacific. There are a lot of them, like thousands. Some are big. Most are tiny specks of coral and rock. The Japanese figured they could defend every single one. Why? Because they had the Imperial Japanese Navy, the best in the world at that time. They controlled the seas, they controlled the air, and they figured the Americans would have to fight them for every inch of territory. That's where the Allied prisoners came in. After the fall of places like the Philippines and Singapore, tens of thousands of American, British, Australian, and Filipino soldiers ended up in Japanese POW camps. The conditions were brutal. We're talking starvation rations, tropical diseases, forced labor, and guards who treated prisoners like they were subhuman. The Geneva Convention, the Japanese never signed it. They didn't care. One of the worst camps was Cabanatuan in the Philippines. Over 8,000 prisoners crammed into a camp designed for far fewer. Men died every day from malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and plain old starvation. The guards beat prisoners for the smallest infractions, sometimes for no reason at all. And if you tried to escape, forget it. You'd die in the jungle, or the locals would turn you in, or you'd make it to the coast and have nowhere to go. The ocean was your prison wall. The Japanese guards knew this. They walked around with this smug confidence. Where are you going to run? There's nothing but water for 1,000 miles. Even if you got off the island, there's no rescue coming. The Americans are too far away. They're losing the war. You're stuck here, and we control everything. But the guards didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that a general named Douglas MacArthur was sitting in Australia, absolutely furious, planning his return. And when I say furious, I mean the man took it personally. MacArthur had been forced to abandon the Philippines in 1942. He left thousands of his men behind. He promised them he'd be back, and he meant it. So the challenge was this. How do you fight an enemy that controls hundreds of fortified islands, has a massive navy, and is dug in so deep that taking each island would cost thousands of lives? How do you even get close to Japan when they have this enormous defensive perimeter? And how do you do it fast enough to save the prisoners who are dying by the hundreds every week in those camps? The Japanese thought they had the perfect defense, but they were about to learn a hard lesson in military strategy. Let me explain what the Japanese strategy actually was. It's called the absolute national defense sphere. Sounds fancy, right? Basically, after their initial conquests, Japanese military planners drew a big circle on the map around their new empire. Inside that circle, theirs. Outside, enemy territory. The idea was simple. Defend everything inside the circle. Make it so costly for the Allies to break through that they'd eventually give up and negotiate peace. To make this work, they fortified key islands with tens of thousands of troops. Places like Truk, Rabaul, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas. These became giant military bases. They had airfields for bombers, harbors for battleships, supply depots, hospitals, everything. And between the big bases, they scattered smaller garrisons on hundreds of other islands. The thinking was that these smaller outposts would act like an early warning system. If the Americans attacked one, the nearest big base would send reinforcements by ship or plane. It was a layered defense, and on paper, it looked unbeatable. The Americans would have to fight their way through thousands of miles of ocean, taking island after island, losing men and ships the whole way. By the time they got close to Japan, they'd be exhausted, low on supplies, and facing the strongest defenses right at the home islands. The Japanese were so confident in this plan that they didn't even consider alternatives. Their entire military doctrine was built around decisive battles. Find the enemy fleet, sink it in one massive engagement, and the war's over. That's how they won against the Russians in 1905. That's how they thought they'd win again. But Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz had a different idea. MacArthur was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet. These two men didn't always agree on strategy, but they both understood one thing. Fighting for every island was suicide. The Japanese wanted a grinding war of attrition, so the Allies decided not to give them one. This is where island hopping comes in. But first, let me clarify what island hopping actually means, because a lot of people get this wrong. Island hopping doesn't mean you skip all the islands. It means you skip the ones that don't matter. Instead of attacking every single Japanese base, you figure out which islands are actually strategically important. Which ones have deep harbors for your ships? Which ones have space for airfields? Which ones cut off enemy supply lines? You take those islands, and the rest, you just leave them there. Think about it like this. Imagine you're playing a game of chess, and your opponent has pieces scattered all over the board. You don't have to capture every single pawn. You just need to control the key squares, cut off their supply lines, trap their important pieces. Eventually the pawns don't matter anymore because they can't do anything. That's island hopping. You leapfrog over the heavily defended islands and take the weaker ones nearby. Then you build an airfield on the island you just captured. Now your planes can bomb the big Japanese base you skipped. You cut off their supply ships. No food, no fuel, no ammunition, no reinforcements. The garrison is still there, but they're not a threat anymore. They're just sitting there, slowly starving, completely cut off from the war. And here's the genius part. Every time you take a new island and build an airfield, you extend your range. Your bombers can hit targets farther away. Your fighters can escort them. You build a chain of bases, each one supporting the next, moving closer and closer to Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese are stuck defending islands that no longer matter. The first big test of this strategy was the Gilbert Islands in late 1943. The Americans attacked Tarawa, a tiny atoll with a huge airfield. The battle was brutal. The Marines took heavy casualties, but they won. And once they had Tarawa, they used it as a base to hit the Marshall Islands next. Then came the Marshalls in early 1944. This time, the Americans didn't attack every island in the chain. They hit Kwajalein and Eniwetok, the two biggest atolls with the best harbors. They bypassed heavily fortified places like Wotie and Maloelap, left them to rot, built new airstrips on the islands they took and moved on. The Japanese commanders were confused. Why weren't the Americans attacking their strongest bases? Why were they going around them? It didn't make sense according to Japanese military thinking. You're supposed to face your enemy head-on in a decisive battle. This was something else. This was a war of maneuver, not attrition, and it got worse for the Japanese. Once the Americans had bases in the Marshalls, they were in range of Truk, the Japanese Navy's biggest base in the Pacific. Truk was like their Pearl Harbor, massive harbor, huge fleet anchorage, supply depot, airfields, everything. The Japanese thought it was untouchable. In February 1944, American carrier planes launched a massive surprise attack on Truk. They sank dozens of ships, destroyed hundreds of planes, and turned the base into a smoldering ruin. The Japanese Navy had to abandon Truk. They pulled their big ships back to safer harbors closer to Japan. And just like that, Truk became irrelevant. The Americans didn't even bother invading it. They just flew over it, bombed it whenever they felt like it, and moved on. By mid-1944, the pattern was clear. The Americans would pick a target, invade, build an airfield, use that airfield to support the next invasion. Leapfrog, repeat. Every time they did this, they cut off more Japanese garrisons. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were left stranded on islands with no way to fight back. No ships to evacuate them, no planes to supply them. They were just stuck. Now let's talk about what this meant for the prisoners, because while all this island hopping was happening, there were still tens of thousands of Allied POWs scattered across the Japanese Empire. And the closer the Americans got, the more nervous the Japanese guards became. At first, the guards didn't care. The war was far away. But as American planes started appearing in the skies, things changed. Orders came down from Japanese high command. If the Allies invaded, the prisoners were to be killed. All of them. The Japanese military had a policy that dying in battle was honorable, but surrender was the ultimate disgrace. They applied this logic to prisoners too. If you surrendered, you weren't even human anymore. So why would they let prisoners fall into American hands? There's a chilling document called the Kill All Order that some Japanese commanders received. It basically said if there was any risk of prisoners being liberated, execute them all. Make sure none survive. Some camps took this order seriously. Others didn't. It depended entirely on the individual commander. The prisoners had no idea about any of this. They just knew that as the war turned against Japan, the guards got meaner. Food rations shrank, beatings increased, and the guards started acting paranoid. Some prisoners noticed the guards building execution grounds, trenches, firing pits. They didn't know what it meant, but it wasn't good. At Palawan Island in the Philippines, there was a small camp holding about 150 American prisoners. These men were used as forced labor to build an airfield. In December 1944, American planes started bombing Palawan regularly. The base was being destroyed. The guards panicked. On December 14th, the guards herded the prisoners into air raid shelters. Then they doused the shelters with gasoline and set them on fire. Men who tried to escape were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 prisoners survived by jumping off a cliff into the sea and swimming to safety. The rest burned to death or were shot. This became known as the Palawan Massacre. It was one of the worst atrocities against POWs in the Pacific War, and it sent a clear message to the American military. If they didn't move fast, the Japanese were going to kill all the prisoners before they could be rescued. Back at Cabanatuan, the situation was getting desperate. The camp, which once held over 8,000 men, was down to about 500 by late 1944. Most had been shipped to Japan or other locations, but the men who remained were the sickest, the weakest. They couldn't be moved, and they knew what was coming. The guards were getting orders, the Americans were getting close. Time was running out. This is where the story gets intense, because the American military realized they had to act fast. Island hopping was winning the war, but but it was also putting prisoners in immediate danger, so they came up with a plan. A crazy, desperate plan to raid Cabanatuan and rescue the prisoners before the Japanese could execute them. But before we get to that, we need to talk about MacArthur's return to the Philippines, because that's when everything came to a head. October 20th, 1944. Douglas MacArthur wades ashore at Leyte Island in the Philippines. He's back, just like he promised. The cameras are rolling. The whole thing is staged for dramatic effect, but MacArthur doesn't care. He walks onto the beach, water up to his knees, and delivers his famous line, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The liberation of the Philippines had begun, and the Japanese knew they were in trouble. The Philippines were critical. Lose the Philippines, and Japan loses access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Lose that oil, and the war is over. So the Japanese threw everything they had into defending the islands. They sent reinforcements, they launched kamikaze attacks, they dug into the mountains and prepared for a fight to the death. But the Americans kept coming. By January 1945, they landed on Luzon, the main island where Manila was located. MacArthur's forces pushed inland. The Japanese defenders fought back hard, but they were being overwhelmed. And that's when the race against time started for the prisoners at Cabanatuan. The camp was only about 30 miles behind Japanese lines. The Japanese were retreating through the area. There were thousands of enemy soldiers between the camp and the American front lines. If the Americans waited too long, the guards would execute the prisoners. If they moved too fast and got caught, the rescue mission would fail, so the US Army put together a special unit, the 6th Ranger Battalion, about 120 Rangers supported by Filipino guerrillas. Their mission? Sneak 30 miles behind enemy lines, raid the camp, rescue 500 prisoners, and get them all back to safety. Oh, and do it without alerting the thousands of Japanese troops in the area. It was insane. But they didn't have a choice. The Rangers moved out on January 28, 1945. They traveled at night, hiding during the day. Filipino guerrillas guided them through the jungle and kept watch for Japanese patrols. The guerrillas were incredible. They knew every trail, every village, every hiding spot. Without them, the mission would have been impossible. By January 30th, the Rangers were in position about a mile from the camp. They spent the day observing, counting guards, mapping the layout, figuring out the best way in and out. The camp was surrounded by open fields, no cover. If the Japanese spotted them approaching, the prisoners were dead, the Rangers were dead. Game over. The plan was simple. Wait until dark, crawl across the field, hit the camp from multiple sides at once, overwhelm the guards before they could react, grab the prisoners, get out fast. As the sun set on January 30th, the Rangers started their approach. They crawled on their bellies through the tall grass, slowly, quietly. Every sound felt like thunder. The guards walked their patrols, completely unaware that 120 American soldiers were creeping toward them in the darkness. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the Rangers opened fire. The attack was over in less than 30 minutes. The Rangers stormed the camp from multiple directions. They killed the guards before most even knew what was happening. Inside the barracks, the prisoners were in shock. Some thought it was a Japanese trick. Others thought they were dreaming. Malnutrition and disease had messed with their minds. They couldn't process what was happening. The Rangers had to physically drag some prisoners out of the barracks. "We're Americans. We're here to get you out. Move, move." The prisoners stumbled into the night, many of them too weak to walk. The Rangers and guerrillas carried them. They loaded the sickest onto makeshift stretchers and carts pulled by Carabao, the Filipino water buffalo. The whole column started moving back toward American lines. Behind them, the camp was in flames. The Rangers set fires to cover their retreat. Japanese reinforcements were already moving toward the camp, but the Rangers had timed everything perfectly. By the time the Japanese figured out what happened, the rescue force was miles away. It took 2 days to get all the prisoners back to safety. They moved slowly because so many of the rescued men couldn't walk. Every step was agony for them. But they kept going, and on February the 1st, 1945, they crossed back into American-held territory. 512 prisoners rescued, all of them alive. Not a single prisoner was left behind. The Cabanatuan raid became one of the most successful rescue missions in military history. It proved that island hopping wasn't just about taking territory, it was about speed, about getting close enough to save lives before it was too late. If the Americans had fought their way through every Japanese stronghold the old way, those prisoners would have been executed months earlier. Island hopping saved them. But the story doesn't end there, because while Cabanatuan was a success, there were other camps, other prisoners, and not all of them were as lucky. As the war continued, American forces kept leapfrogging Japanese positions. They took Iwo Jima in February and March 1945. Brutal fight, 26,000 American casualties. But once they had Iwo Jima, they had an airfield halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Damaged bombers could land there instead of ditching in the ocean. Fighters could escort bombers all the way to Tokyo. The noose was tightening. Then came Okinawa in April 1945, even closer to Japan, even bloodier. Over 12,000 Americans killed. But the island hopping strategy kept working. The Japanese couldn't stop it. Every island the Americans took became another base, another stepping stone. The Japanese Navy was almost gone. The Air Force was running out of planes. They started using kamikaze attacks because they didn't have enough experienced pilots left. It was desperation. By summer 1945, Japan was cut off. The island hopping campaign had worked exactly as planned. The Japanese Empire, which once stretched across thousands of miles, was now isolated. Supply lines were cut. Millions of Japanese soldiers were stranded on bypassed islands, unable to fight, unable to help defend the home islands. They weren't starving because the Americans bombed them. They were starving because no supplies could reach them. The ocean that was supposed to protect them became their prison. And here's the dark reality. On those bypassed islands, Japanese garrisons turned to cannibalism. They ate their dead. They ate prisoners. Some even ate each other. Discipline broke down. Officers lost control. Men went insane from hunger and disease. These once proud soldiers, who thought they were invincible, were reduced to fighting over scraps of food on forgotten islands while the war passed them by. The Japanese guards at prison camps across the Pacific realized they weren't getting rescued. No ships were coming, no planes, no reinforcements. They were on their own. And when the war ended in August 1945, many of these guards just disappeared into the jungle rather than face justice for what they'd done. When Allied forces finally liberated the remaining prison camps after Japan's surrender, what they found was horrific. Mass graves, survivors who weighed 70 or 80 pounds, men who looked like skeletons. The world saw photographs of these prisoners, and the shock was immediate. People couldn't believe human beings could do this to other human beings. The trials came later. Some Japanese officers were executed for war crimes. Others got prison sentences. A few escaped justice entirely. But the prisoners who survived never forgot. Many of them struggled with physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Island hopping completely changed how wars are fought. It proved that you don't need to meet your enemy head-on if you can outmaneuver them. The Japanese built a fortress empire, but it didn't matter. The Americans just went around it. They turned Japan's strength into a weakness. All those fortified islands, they became prisons for the defenders. The strategy saved lives, not just the prisoners at Cabanatuan, but thousands of American soldiers who would have died taking islands that didn't matter. Instead of fighting the Japanese on their terms, the Allies made them fight on Allied terms. That's the definition of smart warfare. For the prisoners, island hopping was the difference between life and death. If the Americans had fought a conventional island-by-island campaign, those prison camps would have been liberated months or even years later. Most of the prisoners wouldn't have survived that long. The speed of the island-hopping campaign put pressure on the Japanese so fast that they couldn't execute all the prisoners before being overrun. But let's be honest, not every prisoner was saved. Thousands died in camps that were never raided. Thousands more died on hell ships, unmarked transport vessels that were bombed by Allied planes who didn't know prisoners were on board. The Palawan massacre happened even with island hopping in full swing. War is ugly, and this was one of the ugliest chapters in modern history. The Japanese guards, who thought their island prisons were escape-proof, learned a hard lesson. Geography is only an advantage if you control the space in between. Once the Americans controlled the seas and skies, those islands became tombs. The guards went from feeling invincible to feeling trapped. The same ocean that kept prisoners in now kept the guards isolated from any hope of rescue or reinforcement. MacArthur kept his promise. He returned, and the island-hopping strategy made it possible. Without it, the war would have dragged on for years. Japan might have forced a negotiated peace. The atomic bombs might never have been dropped. History would look very different. But here's something most people don't think about. After the war, the United States used the same island-hopping principle in the Cold War. Military bases scattered across the Pacific, each one a link in the chain, each one supporting the next. Guam, Okinawa, South Korea, the Philippines. These weren't just random bases, they were the legacy of island hopping. The US military learned that controlling key points is more important than controlling everything. That lesson still applies today. The men who survived Cabanatuan and other camps went home. They tried to rebuild their lives. Many struggled. PTSD wasn't really understood back then. These guys were just expected to move on. Most of them never talked about what happened. It was too painful. But their story is one of the most incredible survival stories of the war. And the Rangers who pulled off the Cabanatuan raid, they became legends. The mission was studied in military schools for decades. It's still taught today as an example of how to execute a high-risk rescue operation. Everything had to go right. And somehow it did. The island-hopping strategy wasn't just a military tactic, it was a paradigm shift. It showed that traditional thinking doesn't always win wars. Creativity does. Adaptability does. The Japanese were trapped in a mindset that demanded decisive battles and holding every inch of ground. The Americans saw the bigger picture and played a different game entirely. The prisoners who were rescued got to see their families again. They got to live. That's what matters most. And the men who rescued them became part of one of the greatest military operations in history. The raid on Cabanatuan proved that even in the middle of a massive war, individual lives still matter. Rescuing 506 starving men from behind enemy lines didn't change the outcome of the war, but it changed the lives of those 500 men and their families. That's worth something. So yeah, the Japanese guards trusted their island prisons. They thought the ocean was their ally. They thought no one could touch them. But MacArthur and his island-hopping strategy turned the tables. The guards became the prisoners. The hunters became the hunted, and the men who were supposed to be locked away forever walked out alive. That's the power of thinking differently. That's the power of not playing by your enemy's rules. The Japanese wanted a slugfest. The Americans gave them a chess match. And in chess, the player who controls the board wins. It doesn't matter how strong your pieces are if you can't move them. The Japanese had the pieces, the Americans controlled the board. And that's how a strategy with a simple name, island hopping, changed the course of World War II and saved thousands of lives in the process. The guards never saw it coming, and by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. If you made it this far, subscribe for more history that challenges what you think you know.